spectrum of what we've been discussing over the past day and a half. So we'll just pick some of them and put them out. Well, I'll start with this one. So we touched on the scope of the review of the Charities Act, and of course the definition of charitable purpose is not within scope for that review. So there's a question, and there was some discussion of this, and what a revisited definition of charitable purpose might look like in New Zealand law. So someone has asked, well, what would that look like? Could we talk a bit more about, if we ever did revisit the definition of charitable purpose under New Zealand law, what would people want it to look like? So does anyone want to speak to that? What could change there? Do you want something like what we've got in Australia, where we have a longer list of heads? So I think Oonagh's got his hand up.
As usual, all I can tell you is what others have done. So, when other countries have broadened their definition of what charitable purposes are, they've always gone from pencil, which is what you actually have in your legislation at the moment. So they haven't lost that. But what they've done is they've expanded the last box, the other purpose is beneficial to the community, and they've come in with the modern hooks for things today that we generally allow charitable status for, but make it more clear. So you know what little hook to hang your coat on when you apply to charity services, for example, to be registered. Two ways of doing that. So here's my question back to you. When we did this in Ireland, we broadened out 12 new heads under other purposes beneficial to the community. The only heads that were accepted were the ones that Revenue then gave charitable status to under their own strict rules. So they wouldn't include promotion of human rights, which puts us in a bad little box in Ireland, and they didn't include promotion of amateur sport. So those are the two we left out in Ireland. So think about, if you were to extend your final box, for your charity, what would be the thing that you'd like to see as the little hook that would work for you? And are there things that are not included at the moment you'd like in, or that you'd hate to see going in? Because I think that's where your conversation goes around that issue.
I just like to put a plug in for the discussion document there, because one of the questions is, should we extend purposes? So, specific question. People to actually put some thoughts on.
Thank you. Fiona Martin from University of New South Wales. Just building on from what Oonagh said, in Australia one thing we did look at, because we also have a statutory definition with a number of broader purposes and there are more purposes than under the pencil, relief of poverty, relief of advancement of education, advancement of religion. But with the poverty issue, there was this worry that poverty and relief of poverty is now very much on, interdependent with the welfare state and stigmatised, and a whole lot of different feelings came up into that particular area. So they did change the way that we talk about relief of poverty. So that's something slightly different to what Oonagh was saying, but maybe something that wants to be considered as well.
Is there another? Yeah.
I was just going to remind you that in Wales, you need to be able to not only meet the needs of charity, but you also need to be able to show that you have public benefit. This is 2006 Act. So that when charities report, they have to say how they met the public benefit. So it's not just poverty education.
Yeah, and I suppose if the architecture of the legal definition of charity were ever revisited here, it could not happen without at the same time thinking about that question of public benefit and how it intersects with the expressed heads of charity. And as we know, in different jurisdictions, that intersection plays out quite differently, and in all cases seems to play out controversially. So I
I think not that I have any particular perspective on this, but it was some interesting things that have come out of the roadshow, especially from a TL Māori space. Like, I think we heard in one session this thought from an iwi that we want to benefit our iwi. That's essentially, that's our public benefit. And who are you to tell us how we should do that? Why should we be fitting into a box of, 17th century law, which I thought was a really interesting and probably challenging comment for our policy colleagues.
Kia ora, my name is Hamish Lindstrom. My thought is, if we're trying to cram charities into a loosely defined fourth head, but maybe instead of trying to rigidly encapsulate more definitions in the Act, we should perhaps instead try to put some rules or a test around what is a public benefit for charities to meet when you're deciding, is it a public benefit and a charitable purpose?
I might just make one brief response to that, and when we can move on to another question. I want to go back to what Justice Joe Williams said earlier, because I think, as Oonagh has said, one way of approaching this question of defining charity is to look at the various models that build upon the Penzl case and work with that existing taxonomy, if you want to put it that way. That's one way to do it. That's the way that we see being chosen by jurisdictions up to this point in time. But I think what Justice Williams put out there today was, why not just wipe the slate clean and start again? A very provocative and exciting thought. We know New Zealand had a history of taking bold policy and legal reforms, and who knows, maybe this is the moment for you to really think seriously about whether Justice Williams' approach is a good one. So I think that's something we should bear in mind in thinking about these questions of legal definition. There's the option, there are the options Oonagh put to us, which are the options of building on what we have, but there are also more radical options on the table potentially.
Okay. Another different question here. Do charities need to be regulated? All the speakers have made assumptions that charities need to be regulated. No one went into the question and debated the need for regulation and a regulator. Are charities that broken in New Zealand that we need a regulator? So an interesting challenge of an assumption that's been out there.
I really wasn't going to talk this much. Typical academic. I can just tell you what happened in Australia. Okay, so let's go back 18 years to 2000, the Shepherd report on 2000-2001 on the inquiry into the definition of charities in Australia. Now, there was nothing in the terms of reference about whether or not Australian charities should have a regulator. At that stage, the only interaction with the tax system and for charities in any sort of way was that they had to be endorsed by the tax office. And then obviously the GST came in, so they had to pay GST. All right? So, and I analysed all the submissions to that report. I'm a very sad and boring person. There are about 300, and I worked out over 90%, even though it wasn't in terms of reference, over 90%, including Michael DiCenzo, who was then Deputy Commissioner of Taxation, all said it's not the role of the tax office to be de facto regulator, and that's what's happening because we're the ones that deal with the tax concession. You need to have an independent, call it regulator, manager, whatever you want to call it, but some independent body needs to look after charities. It's not working the way it is. It's not that the charity sector is broken, it's just that it's not appropriate or the tax office, who think everyone's a tax cheat, to be looking after the charity sector. And the charity sector was very vocal because in Australia, the way the ATO was operating was there were various little charity units all around Australia. They'd come, you know, one charity would be doing X, and in Sydney it'd be given charitable status, and it was doing X in Brisbane, and the Brisbane tax office people would say, no, you're not a charity. So there was all that inconsistency and a feeling that, you know, you're forever being scrutinised and told you're a tax cheat. For a variety of reasons, and including the ATO, they didn't want it. They said it's not our expertise. We don't know much about charities. We need to have a body of public bureaucrats who can actually understand this hundreds and hundreds of years of charity law, all the nuances we've been talking about, and make really good decisions.
This discussion really takes me back to 1993, I think. The period 93, 95. I was part of a debate that went on in the then most well-resourced national umbrella group, cross-sector, for all parts of the sector, from religious groups through to surf lifesaving, you know. Do we need some kind of regulator in the sector? And I've got to say the debate was so interesting that, you know, lifelong friends and colleagues fell apart over this. But we did come to a conclusion about 1995 that we did need a monitoring agency, and I use that term advisedly. We didn't want a regulator. And if you know, as people have pointed out, and Sue and I have been pointing out on the roadshow, the dictionary definition of regulation, you know, it's regulating the flow of something. You're controlling it. Monitoring is keeping an eye on it and acting when something's going wrong. And that's what we wanted. Now, that was about 1995, I think, from memory, but it took until 2002, there was the National Working Group, which came up with the quote that I read out yesterday afternoon in the last session. Maybe not many people were awake, I recognise that, but it was about the need, after a national consultation, there was a nationally acknowledged need for a monitoring agency, which would be at arm's length from government, so that it would be seen by the sector as independent from government. It would sit halfway between government and the sector, and there'd be, in that sense, mutual ownership, that we would have as much invested as government would. And that was widely supported across the sector. So the sector wanted a monitoring agency. It's not quite what we've got at the moment, but that's what we wanted.
Interesting point. If I can just add that I spent most of my professional career as an auditor, so I'm a black hat thinker, auditing corporate organisations, government organisations, and not-for-profit and charitable organisations. And from experience, we've seen the impact, in terms of negative impacts, possibly greater in the charitable space, especially around trust and confidence. So I can think of a specific example of a charity that was involved in some very bad behaviour. It wasn't one that we looked after, but it had kids in its name. We acted for two other charities that had kids in their name, and we those charities immediately saw a significant decline in their public donations because of the soundbite mistake from the one that had kids in their name that had been doing bad behaviour. So I think the impact is much greater in our sector of bad behaviour, and therefore, while it may only be a very small percentage in any population that will be involved in bad behaviour, I've always taken the view that perhaps we need a stronger monitoring group to ensure that that bad behaviour is called out. Really.
And an agency with the powers of government to weed out the cowboys. That was explicit words that we were using at that time.
So thanks, Bev from Oxfam in Australia. When the debate came to Australia about whether we ought to have a regulator, the charity I was involved with and the charity I'm involved with now, both advocated strongly for the need for a central regulator. regulator in our sector. When I think about it from a lawyer's perspective, the complexity of many states' laws, different forms of incorporation, and different bodies that one went to if you had a claim that you needed to make against your charity for failing you or that wasn't pursuing its purpose. It was just an absolute maze, and I think, Mel, your slide today on fundraising is just really one snapshot of the maze that anyone trying to fulfil their governance or their managerial responsibilities face, particularly if they were a national charity. So, on the one hand, for me, as a lawyer who has great confidence in the rule of law and the role of courts to support the community to achieve good outcomes if they suffer loss, I did see that the regulator had a function in terms of a place that could provide support to the people working in the sector, the volunteers, the beneficiaries, as well as to the community, but not just as a cop, but also as a facilitator of good practice. And I think that there is a benefit to that being provided in form, but in, I think, proportionate regulation and a proportionate approach is the thing that we've enjoyed most in Australia.
Any other thoughts on that very big question that we started with yesterday and still with? All right, well, I thought myself that one of the more interesting conversations we've had was around the question of accumulation and intergenerational transfers within charities. And we've got some questions on accumulation, so maybe we put them out there. So one question is, well, if we're thinking about restricting what charities can do when it comes to accumulation, what exactly is the mischief here? What is the problem that requires legal intervention to solve? So I think that's a question to put out there. The other one is more specific. How to deal with non-cash reserves when dealing with questions of distribution and accumulation. And the questioner gives the instance of historic buildings and how they are to be valued and understood in those processes. So I know Ian will have views on this, but can I throw that open to see if others have any observations on those two questions? I think there's a hand up here.
Hi, I'm Marina from Play Centres. I was going to ask the same question around the non-cash values, especially if we've got a large property portfolio, and especially the result that would come if the leasing standards came in and we were to then have to put all those on the books. Would they be included in the sort of accumulated assets? And could this inadvertently lead to, some of our charities have very high value property portfolios, but we don't have the revenue that goes alongside those. They're struggling just to maintain them, let alone if you were to have to distribute based on that, you could end up very quickly in a cash negative position as a result of the law. Is that something that's been considered?
And add to that, historic buildings, which a lot of the accountants in the room would argue are liabilities more than they are assets.
Maybe I could say something that's relevant to that, looking at what other jurisdictions have done. So I guess in Australia, the minimum distribution requirements that we have don't apply to all charities. It's only a subset of charities get donation concessions. So not all charities in Australia get donation concessions, only some do. So it's basically philanthropic foundations in Australia, certain types of public and private ancillary funds that are subject to minimum distribution rules. They might be less likely to be in a situation where they own historic buildings or other assets like that are harder to realise. There are also requirements that apply to those philanthropic foundations, those ancillary funds, and duties that the trustees of those funds are under, including that they must ensure sufficient realisable assets to meet distribution requirements year on year. And so that's sort of something that we take into account. You could look at Canada, I suppose, where the minimum distribution rules apply to all charities, not a restricted set of them, and it's 3.5% of your property, less some liabilities, but then you start taking off from property that's directly used in pursuing the charity's purpose. So if you're using a historic building to pursue your purpose, you don't count that when working out the 3.5%. So other jurisdictions, I guess, have done things to try and grapple with those sorts of issues.
Bernard Lewis here. Just coming back to the first question that was raised about whether businesses should be regulated. I didn't ask the question, but I've been thinking the same question through, and I wondered whether there's anybody from DR and can maybe reply as to why that question was raised in the modernisation document, because I don't see a problem. Clearly, there are probably the odd rat bag that's floating around. There's always a bad apple somewhere, but the regulators have been dealing with them anyway. So it's just a question of why was the question answered, or why was the question asked?
I suppose just a general comment in response to that was that I think if you look at the questions that we're asking in the chapter on business, we're not really looking to move the dial much on anything. We're responding to some evidence of concern out there about certain risks potentially to charitable funds moving into being lost through trading, and the kind of transparency of reporting standards and so on. But it's not to preempt the outcome of the consultation and subsequent work. But I don't think it's an area that we're seeing requires major change. If that answers the question.
Further views on that, or views on accumulation?
If it doesn't require major change, what are the minor changes that you're considering? It is a big issue, Peter Van Hout, Methodist Church of New Zealand, sorry. But the tax working group have brought it up, and because it was in the tax working group, some of the media have picked it up, and then suddenly, it's from one or two comments in those reports, it's suddenly become an issue everywhere. And prior to the tax working group issuing its interim reports, it wasn't an issue anywhere other than sanitarium and the IOD.
And I suppose this sanitarium issue, everyone uses it as an example.
Yeah.
As if it's something really bad. It's a business that is owned by a charity that sends all of its profits to that charity. It is interesting how it's sort of like Greenpeace. We put Greenpeace up sometimes as a name that people make all of these assumptions about, rather than what the actual facts of the situation are.
I mean, I suppose in terms of what the questions that we're asking are in the document. I mean, I hope it doesn't exaggerate a problem that doesn't exist, but there is some evidence of concern out there. I'll just put it that way.
So if I can comment on, I guess, not so much the risks, because I guess as soon as you have charities operating businesses, there are risks of loss of assets. I'm not sure those are accumulation specific or they're just a general risk that might apply whenever you're operating a charity. But just thinking about that, the income tax exemption and carrying on of businesses, I guess, and Fiona might disagree with me as to the rationale for providing a tax exemption to charities in the first place, but I think often it's seen as a subsidy for charities to achieve more of what the public benefit that they're producing, and there's got to be a reason for that. I mean, they exist so they'll be producing that anyway. Why do we have to give them a tax concession to help them produce more? What's the failing? And a couple of the presenters have touched on this. Generally the view is charities can't raise capital as easily as for-profits. And so the reason we provide them with the income tax concession is that we need to make up for that difficulty in raising capital. So in fact, we want to give them an advantage. We want them to keep some of the money in the charity running a business because that puts them on a level playing field for profits. If they were spending all the money straight away, there'd be nothing on which the tax concession could operate because their expenses would equal their income, so there'd be nothing to tax. So the whole rationale of the income tax exemption generally is sort of seen as making up for that difficulty in raising capital. So in some ways we ought not to be worried about businesses keeping money in the business and not distributing it too quickly or spending it on directly carrying out charitable purposes.
Hi, Stuart here from the Land Revenue. So just, obviously I don't agree with Fiona. I mean, I think the same thinking as in New Zealand as with Australia and the ATO. We do support regulation. It's not the Land Revenue's job to regulate charities, so we do support an independent regulator or monitor of the sector. As far as accumulation goes, you will have noticed the tax working group did look at accumulation. It's worthwhile, so it did focus on private foundations. So it's quite concerned about accumulation for closely held charities where the settler or donor has control over the charity. And I think it has quite a few examples where some of those foundations, they don't conduct charitable purposes themselves, they're just there to raise funds for other charities, and they just simply don't distribute. Or don't distribute very much at all. And so that was really what got the attention of the tax working group in terms of accumulation. And so they already have money, so that you can force them to distribute because they're very liquid in terms of their investments. In terms of businesses, I mean, it's a challenging one. I think the tax working group got a lot of submissions to say that businesses in the charitable sector should be paying tax. And so they had to think about that as part of their report. And I think where they ended up going was thinking, was really, I guess, what you said just before. They thought, well, charities can raise money however they want, they can raise it through businesses, but the real mystery from a tax perspective is those charities that raise this money but they don't ever distribute or use the money for charitable purposes. So they kept going back to that as the main issue. They did really conclude that they need to do more work. A lot more thought needs to be given to this area. And so I guess by DIA asking the questions in the consultation document means there's going to be a lot of feedback on that it's going to be useful for all of us to better understand some of the pressures with accumulation. So yes, in Land Revenue we'll be reading all the submissions that you make on this area because we are interested in it.
I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I remember that the number of foundations that are registered as charities is actually very small. The percentage is very small. And sometimes we make a change in an act or a accounting standard or something else that has much more far-reaching and unintended consequences than we anticipate just to fix perhaps a big issue, but an issue in a very small part of the population. So I think we should think about that before we say, yes, this is a good idea and we've got to fix these foundations. I'm a trustee of a charity in England and Wales at the moment, which I'm not saying they have all the answers, but one of the things we have to think about is our reserves policy. So when we file our accounts, we have to have our reserves policy stated. And that's a really interesting conversation to have with your other trustees. Why are we keeping these reserves? How much do we need in the way of reserves? What are they for? What are we going to do with the reserves that we aren't going to keep? In other words, how are we going to distribute excess reserves? And I think, listening to Zealandia, listening to Maori organisations and so on, that may be, I'm putting it forward as maybe a more effective
Work Charities Act, how will the feedback presented at the DIA community presentations be incorporated into the formal review process without a formal written submission? So obviously there's been a lot of feedback provided at this great roadshow that's been going around the country, and I know for a fact that a number of the people that I've sat next to will not be making submissions, but they have made comments during the meeting.
We've been capturing all the feedback that we've heard at the consultation meetings. So we've had 2 or 3 or 4 staff at all the meetings recording the conversations. Generally, there's, for those of you who haven't attended one, there's a DIA presentation, Sue and Dave present, and then we have table discussions and feedback. Exactly like this, really. So that's all going into the that's all feedback that will be considered. Well, what we have been trying to reinforce, and this message goes to everyone in this room too, that if you've got specific feedback, specific comments, written submission is really what we'd like, and that can just be an email. Doesn't have to be an enormous tome, just however you like. But we are listening at those meetings, and it is all being recorded.
Okay, well, we move to another question. So there's been quite a lot of discussion on governance, and at some points in that discussion, some of the speakers have touched on the question of how to educate governors of charities on best practice and their legal duties and so forth. And so one of our questions has invited us to resume that conversation about education. What are the most effective, best ways of educating charity governors about their responsibilities and their functions? Does anyone want to sort of take that up? Yes?
For many years I've seen that there's some really good coordinated bodies around the country, in different parts of the country, like Community Waikato, there's Wheelhouse in New Plymouth, there's the Community Services Council in Wellington North, and these organisations do provide training in their environment. What I've also seen is that when a government agency decides to provide free, and a lot of those organisations, by the way, in those regional centres do have to charge a little bit. They keep it as low as they can, just to cover their costs, venue hire and all the rest of it, maybe a bit of food and so on. And then what happens when a government agency comes in and provides the training, and in our questionnaire, Susan, like a questionnaire, a number of people suggested that charity services should provide training. What I've seen when government agencies provide training in a community is that it puts very good community training agencies out of business. So please, sure, find the funding, but get it done by the people who are already established, charitable training providers in the communities.
The question I had that sort of follows on from that is there any way, I mean, I'm in management and my board could do with some more training, but they don't think so. They believe they've had all the training they need anecdotally. We've suggested they co-opt someone, perhaps with a few skills. No, we don't want that. Is there anything, we're a very, very large charity. We have 9,000 volunteers, 11,000 children, 450 centres. Is there no regulation that can come in that says for something of a certain size, there is a minimum standard? Because, yeah, we're a committee. Yeah, so.
I think Rosemary also.
I was going to answer the first question.
Just from my own experience, when I was on the board of a private independent Catholic high school, we had a lot of training anyway, but the government introduced a requirement that anybody who was a non-executive volunteer director had to do 6 hours a year of continuing professional development. Now, how they enforced that was that they said, well, if an independent school doesn't do it, you don't get any grants from us. So that was
board of the local kindergarten, very busy with kids and things, I realised that we were liable as committee members. So the lawyer in me thought, well, I better actually look up the Act, as you do when you're on a kinder board. And I went, actually, we are actually liable. And we had a situation, I mean, we're all volunteers apart from the kinder teacher. We had a situation where some of the fees weren't being paid or were going missing, and the treasurer was a bit, and I just thought, you know, this is, I mean, no one was going to sue us, of course, but, you know, that would be another, I mean, if you're a company, if you're a charitable company and you're subject to the Companies Act, then your duty of care and diligence will require you to keep up with things. So that's another thing. But that might be a kind of, probably a stick, not a carrot. Incentive, yes, incentive. Yeah, but in answer to the first question about how to do it, I can tell you perhaps how not to do it, and that is, which isn't the exact question, but in Australia again, and this is the corporate sector, I know what ASIC does, so that's our companies regulator, is they send out a sheet. When you become a director, apparently they send out a sheet of all your duties. But talking to people, I'm not quite sure how many people receive it or whether they actually read it. So that, I think, is probably not a good way of doing it.
Kia ora. So some ideas off the top of my head. Number one is training only works a little wee bit, you know, I think, what is it, 10-20% of learning. So it's got to be support alongside. So that comes in lots and lots of different ways, and it's volunteers taking their skills from board to board. It's funders recognising the value of organisations. Dave mentioned some of them, the Wheelhouse, Community Waikato, having really solid, predictable, reliable funding so they can build their profile and presence, so they become the local go-to, so you can get hold of a human that you can trust. For the regulator to be really clear about what it is that the messages are that they need to say, and a minimum number of those in the clearest way, you know, like a scrolling tagline across your website, or every time there's an email there's a message, or just putting things in front of people again and again, but simplifying what it is that you've got to say, and recognising that there's a role that the regulator can play in convincing other funders, convincing government policy, convincing lottery funding, all of that stuff, to help the good work that's already going on in the sector to be supported so it can be more sustainable and roll out further.
Thanks. My suggestions for supporting your board to understand where they could benefit from some strengthening. Perhaps do you have a board survey every year? So at Oxfam, for example, we would do a board review, and then it would be independent review of the board every 3 years. That's not only good practice, but also the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade grant funding requires us to demonstrate good governance, and they audit the extent of interest and whether or not there are appropriate systems and controls. So what we found though is that is a good tool where there is one or two people who start to report, actually I didn't, you know, I came on, I felt a bit at sea in this context. The other thing that I've seen done in boards where I've been on a board, and we've heard that other charities might need some help, we've organised a collective day, and it's amazing what peer pressure does when there's a charity board in the room with another charity who's just, you know, smashing it as far as governance principles are concerned, and they suddenly realise we've got a bit of work to do to improve. And just the final and third thing I'd suggest is that the philanthropic foundations do some great work in Australia around capacity building and small grants for organisations that have, you know, maybe they had an embarrassment of riches and suddenly they've got more programs and people in place that they never had before, and they have to scale up. And so I think, you know, there's an opportunity to tap into foundations that, you know, want to secure the grants that they make by knowing they're managed well. Perhaps I'll just add a couple of other, the AICD not-for-profit principles, Justice Connect and the ACNC in Australia all have fantastic resources that are free, and that's very important that they're free.
Miles got his hand up too.
Thank you. Just a miscellany of issues, if I may. Firstly, about governance research. There seems to be, the field seems to have been dominated by two sorts of governance research. That is, American economists who love to crunch numbers and statistics, who use proxies in boards and look at the listed share price and make some outrageous conclusions. Yeah, it doesn't apply to our sector at all. The second is those armchair theorists who sit in their armchair and think about their days of board governance, gives their pearls of wisdom. Neither of those are very reliable. There is an emerging empirical research which, because of the privacy of boards, nobody knows what happened because nobody observed. The black box is being opened and people are observing what actually happens in board meetings. And that's confronting, but it is happening in non-profit boards. I had a research student, a doctoral research student, who followed half a dozen similar sized and interest organisations, and he went to every meeting and sat in the corner for 18 months, and also sat in on the chair CEO review. Now, even there's a bit of iffy about having somebody in the room, but they got over that. The observations that he made about what happens in the board meeting, he also interviewed each directors individually about what they thought happened in the meeting and what he observed happening in the meeting were two different things, or three different things in some cases. So there is some exciting observational evidence about what is actually happening in board meetings. And I think you should have a look at those to inform your governance training. Just some key things that might interest you that I know have come from the empirical literature is when you test how non-profit board members or how people in the sector take in information, basically, what is their learning style? Are they people, when their car won't start, who open the hood and tinker and kick it and cuss until they get it going? Or are they the sort of people who get the manual out of the glove box and read it from page 1 to 50, work out where they've got it and then fix it? I mean, what is their learning styles? How do they take in information? Most adults do it in a number of ways, so quite flexibly, but the overall dominant pathway for non-profit volunteers and people in the social services is oral, and it's through storytelling. And I think the number of nods, people sort of, yeah, that makes sense. We're not book people, sometimes we're action people, but we're really about telling stories. And that's important in your education. A story will stick, and it's through telling stories that people will take, particularly volunteers, will take in information far more. Another bit of empirical information, what would boards like their board governance training to be? Overwhelmingly, they'd love a mentor who would come to each meeting and talk to them. A real human, again, talking, relationship, interaction, stories. And if you can't do that, what's the next best thing to that? Just a warning, there are materials that come out of the US that often consultants get, which are survey tests, scales. US is completely different to Australia and New Zealand. Don't touch them with a barge pole. We've got to develop our own perception and board governance scales. And the final thing before I wrap up is that the Americans say there are some things too important to leave to government, and I think governance training is one of those things, and the Brits learned that when they left it to the Charity Commission. They now own it. It's most important that your peak body and your community bodies and your community building bodies own the space of delivering governance research. It is too critical and too important to leave to government who can subvert the process to their own ends. It must be, in my view, owned by the community and by the sector. Of course, let government fund it without too many strings, but it's important that it remains in the sector and that we don't rely on the government and we don't rely on the regulator to deliver our governance training.
If I can add something to that, Miles, as well, I think we also need to be very cognizant of who we're actually dealing with. And to give a live example, I think there's an age demographic issue. If I look around this room, we are largely of a reasonably homogenous age demographic. I blew a tractor tyre recently. I was in a messy situation. I didn't know what to do. My young son, who happened to be with me, Googled it. And he instantly found a YouTube on exactly my issue from some chap in America on how to fix the dramatic problem we had. So I think we've got to also be open in terms of the context and what's changing and what are the resources that are out there, and actually point people to the right resources too, or the most available resources. Great. Well, I think we've covered the time.
Can I have a 20-second one? I think we need to be careful about the terminology, and governance to me sounds scary. And I think for most people, if they're like, oh, let's do a governance session, they're going to be like, I don't want to go to that. But if you talk about leadership, empowering, enabling, I think we need to be careful about the words that we're using. And it's a tool to empower people to achieve their vision and their mission. And that's the way that we should be talking about it.
One of our best leaders in this country had a wonderful phrase for polarising people, which was how to make the vote go faster. Engaging a discussion around that.
Well, thank you.